Hello, welcome to the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Emily Rutherford-Liska, Executive Director of the Jacksonville Historical Society. This is the show the Jacksonville Historical Society brings to you to help celebrate, discuss, and analyze local history. It's such a pleasure to be here today and such an exciting time in Jacksonville's history, and I have here with me the godfather of Jacksonville history, Jacksonville preservation, Dr. Wayne Wood. Wayne, welcome to the show.
Emily, it's a pleasure to be on the show again.
And you are the one to have here to talk about this exciting time in Jacksonville's history with Super Bowl all around us. I mean, the feeling in the air, it's electric here in the city. And at this time, I guess what the Historical Society loves to step in and do is to tell people, while this is exciting and certainly a landmark milestone event in our city's history, we've had lots of those events in the city's history, and no one knows about that better than you do. And in fact, you've just penned a book certainly detailing those many remarkable events in the city's history. So I thought, what better time to talk about this, the Super Bowl period, special events, and the special events in the city's past. So welcome. Thank you for coming here.
Well, Jacksonville certainly is in the limelight with the Super Bowl, but we've been in the national spotlight many times before, and I thought it might be fun today to talk about the times that Jacksonville has been in the national spotlight, not just recently, but 100 years ago in the past century, when Jacksonville was brought to the forefront of people's attention.
And indeed, we were the darling of the nation on numerous occasions for numerous reasons.
That's right. From
the tourist era to the movie-making era, and in times of calamity, such as the Great Fire. So we really have been well noticed nationally many times.
Without passing up an opportunity to talk about the new book that we've worked on, which does highlight many of these same events, this new book is called The Jacksonville Family Album, 150 Years of the Art of Photography. And this celebrates Jacksonville history through the visible images taken by photographers over the last century and a half. And Jacksonville has really been well documented, as much or better than most other American cities, because during the 1800s we had tourists here, and with the tourists came photographers. So we realized some time ago that we had a great collection of photographs of this long gone period of time. And so the book that we've just produced for the Jacksonville Historical Society, the Jacksonville Family Album, features many of these photographs that we're going to take a look at today and go back in time and see how Jacksonville looked in times gone by, and when it was also a super time in Jacksonville, even though it was over 100 years ago.
And in fact, I'd love to show the book, really, our replica thereof, because the book will be out the roughly second week of February. People can watch for that on the website. Can we get a close-up of this book? And I'll tell you, I'd lift it, but I don't think I'm able. You might want to show your prowess by doing it.
I think you can safely say this is the largest book on Jacksonville history ever published. It does top in at over 6 pounds, 434 pages, with almost 600 photographs, most of them never published before, of Jacksonville history. And these are not just snapshots of Jacksonville. These are works of art. We're celebrating not just our history, but also the art of photography. And almost every one of these pictures could hang on a museum wall. They are beautiful pictures. We've searched all over the country to find the best photos of Jacksonville through time.
And I'm proud to say many of them came from the Jacksonville Historical Society archives. Many other ones came from local citizens who were just very generous in opening up their scrapbooks and their albums. And just from you just were able to glean these from every part you were.
From the Library of Congress to the archives in different states. We've, I think, come up with some of the greatest photographs ever seen of Jacksonville, and this book is hopefully one that citizens will treasure as not only a beautiful book of our history, but also a work of the art of photography.
Well, I know that you've brought some of the photos with you, and they really detail when our city was at the forefront of the nation on so many occasions. And I'm going to...
The closest thing to the Super Bowl that Jacksonville had before was probably in 1888, the Subtropical Exposition. Let's go look at some photos of the Subtropical Exposition. The Subtropical Exposition was built on Main Street in 1888. It started in 1887 and opened in 1888. And it was an attempt to do a World's Fair type event in Jacksonville to attract tourists who had recently started going to other places besides Jacksonville. And so this grand edifice on Main Street near the site of where Waterworks Park is today was constructed, and with great local and national attention. In fact, the President of the United States, the rotund Grover Cleveland, came here with his young bride to inaugurate this fabulous building that had its spires and minarets. The city was all decked out. We had arches across the streets, bowers of flowers, banners, pennants.
Twinkle lights, just like now for the Super Bowl.
Everyone in the city turned out, and it does have very much the feel of the way the Super Bowl does, as we're inviting the nation to come see us. And as the crowds poured into the Subtropical Exposition, which was basically a exhibition touting the beauties and wonders of Florida, from its citrus fruit and farming to its tourism potential and recreation, it was a great affair that was short-lived.
About 4 years, 4 winters, long, and it was open about 4 or 5 months at a stretch, that's right. But an exciting time for the city.
The interior of it, and these are some shots that have not been widely seen before, I don't think they've ever been published, show the interior of this vast hall where Florida and Jacksonville's wares were on display. And you might tell a little bit about the demise of the Subtropical Exposition. It all happened because of yellow fever.
Absolutely, and well, it was just, it ran its course. It opened the winter before the yellow fever epidemic hit, and then the next year it did come back, and the year after that, but eventually the excitement of it died out, as so many big events as that do. And of course we were struggling. We were still struggling to keep the tourist crowd here. They were now heading to the west coast, to California, which few people realize that was our competitor in the early 1890s, late 1880s, the new California sunshine, and they beckoned those tourists with the trains that would head across. So our city fathers pulled that one out. In those days it literally would be called the City Fathers.
Well, some people wonder why Jacksonville was such a tourist destination, and it really relates back to the Civil War. Going back in time a little bit, Jacksonville, and we'll see some pictures of Jacksonville during the Civil War here. Jacksonville was occupied by Union troops 4 different times during the Civil War. And although no great land battles were fought here, there were many skirmishes and river-based battles of gunboats going up and down the St. Johns River. After the war, those soldiers went home and told their friends about Jacksonville. So it's very important that the Civil War led to the tourist era. Here you see a wonderful old shot of a fort overlooking St. John's Bluff. This was occupied by Union troops at this time, although the fort had been built by the rebels, and they were protecting the waterways of the St. John's to keep those Confederate boats out of the river. Here you see a shot that is near the center of downtown where Hemming Park would be today, with Union troops camped in their tents, part of the occupation. And these old shots of soldiers are so rare and beautiful. We've included in the new book about 30 shots of Jacksonville during the Civil War with the soldiers who were there, the different troops. And surprisingly, a large contingent of those troops were black soldiers who came in to occupy Jacksonville during this time. We have wonderful portraits like this young Confederate soldier, and he was camped here in Jacksonville. And then we also have Union soldiers who came in. This young man was guarding the river at Yellow Bluff Fort, and he scrambled down the bank as they saw a Confederate boat coming down the river. He tripped, and one of his colleagues accidentally pulled the trigger and shot him in the heart, and this 19-year-old boy died here in Jacksonville shortly after this picture was taken. It's part of one of the great and sad stories of the Civil War in Jacksonville. But Jacksonville was occupied. It was bleak. The town got burned many times, and here you see the sentries on patrol guarding the city. And there are many of these beautiful old shots that show scenes around the city with people trying to go about their daily activities while this war was going on. And as I say, Jacksonville had a lot of activity on the river. Here you see one of the gunboats that was actually a converted ferry boat that they pulled into service to help keep the rebels from coming down the river. And as soon as the Yankees would leave, the rebels would come back down, and then the Yankees would chase them out again. It kept going on and on with some of these grand old vessels. And here's a deck, a rare picture of the deck of the Pawnee, one of the ships that was active in the St. Johns River, showing those large cannons that were certainly very ominous at that time. There was also a series of these great signal towers that were used by Union soldiers to pass messages up and down the St. Johns River. There was one of these at the mouth of the river at Mayport Mills and one at Yellow Bluff Fort, and they would send signals back and forth. And you see that little shelter at the top. Well, that's where they would hide to get away from snipers when the snipers tried to pick them off on the top of that. So the Civil War was a big era, but it was important not just because of Jacksonville making the news, which it did, but also because all those Yankees came here and they went home and told their friends about Jacksonville. So within just a few short years after the Civil War, these Northerners were pouring into this beautiful city that had been rebuilt after the great Civil War confrontation, and they were here as tourists.
That's right. I mean, we were nothing but pretty much a burned out hull after the Civil War, but the soldiers had seen the beauty of that river. They'd seen the beauty of our weather in the winter time, and just the Northerners flocked here. It was good.
In fact, within about 4 years after the Civil War, the tourists were starting to come. They came on boats of all kinds. Here we see a picture of some tourists coming in on a boat called, I believe, the Oklahomkee, which was one of the river boats that brought tourists down the river. And with tourists, you of course had to have hotels. So many of these great hotels were built. Here's the Carlton House, and here's another of the dozen or so of these large hotels that during the winter time, Jacksonville's population almost doubled with these hotels, as well as smaller boarding houses and guest houses filling up with tourists. Here's the great St. James Hotel, which was one of the best known hotels in the South. And it was facing on what is now Hemming Park, then was called St. James Park. Here you see it in a very scrubby fashion before there were many trees there. But this has always been the heart of the city and now is called Hemming Plaza, right in the middle of downtown Jacksonville. And you can see in this picture the St. James Hotel on the left. Its competitor was the Windsor Hotel, also facing on the park, which was one of the great hotels of Florida's tourist era, which was basically from about 1869 until the late 1880s, when the yellow fever epidemic forever drove them away. But these tourists would pose on the docks in ox carts, donkey wagons, and everything that you could imagine for tourists. There were curios on Bay Street where you could buy a stuffed alligator or a large sunfish or even a stuffed egret or a spoon or something to commemorate your visit to the winter city in the summer land, as Jacksonville was called during this time.
You could take home a baby alligator.
I mean, a baby alligator.
Orange canes, all sorts of fun things.
And yet just a few blocks from all of these elegant hotels down Bay Street, it was basically an unpaved, muddy mess with small buildings that were more akin to a Wild West frontier town. So Jacksonville had this wonderful character of being a frontier town with a river and the beautiful weather and the ocean nearby and these grand hotels, and tourists just flocked here for many years. The next sort of era that I'd like to talk about came after the tourist era, and although things were quiet in the 1890s, there was this war that began or was on the horizon in the late 1890s that was very important in Jacksonville. This was the War of Liberation of Cuba, or the Spanish-American War as it became called. Now, really nothing much ever happened in the Spanish-American War, although
it was a big party.
It was a big party.
Here in Jacksonville.
It was a big party here in Jacksonville. Jacksonville became a launching pad, so to speak, for soldiers and troops who were going to Cuba to invade. And Teddy Roosevelt, who gained his fame with the Rough Riders in this war, called it a dandy little war because really not many people got shot. They went down, and by the time they got there, the treaty was signed and the war was over. But during this war, as we'll see in some of these new pictures, Jackson, let me get my pictures going straight here. Jacksonville was invaded by troops once again. This is in 1898, as over 20,000 Spanish-American war soldiers came to our city. And as they marched down the streets, they set up camps in Springfield, which was a little boggy, and quickly they realized that they wanted higher ground, so they also set up camps in Panama Park in North Jacksonville and also out at the beach. And these different camps collectively became known as Camp Cuba Libre. And these thousands of soldiers were camped there doing their training, waiting around for the war to start. And really not much was going on. They got their weapons and they had all this free time on their hands, so it was only natural that they were a little bit bad. The jails were filled, the bars were full, liquor flowed freely. Many of these soldiers freely met with local young ladies.
Let's say marriages were forged.
Marriages were forged.
One way or the other.
Absolutely true. Many
Yes.
of these young soldiers in the prime of their years were attracted by the beautiful young ladies of Jacksonville, and many of them stayed after the war and were married to local ladies.
And it was a wonderful melding, too, once again, of Northerners and Southerners. Not that Jacksonville hasn't always been a melting pot and a melding, but it happened once again. We also had the unveiling of the Confederate statue at that time. Here, the North and the South coming together for that event.
And here you see some of the troops that were down at the beach. They're doing their marching and training on the hard-packed sand of Jacksonville Beach, a military training ground on the ocean. That must have been a nice place to do their duty. One of the nicest shots that we've included in the book, I think, is from the end of this Spanish-American War era. There was a peace rally in Riverside Park. This is 1898, about Thanksgiving, just a few months before the war was over, when thousands of people came into Riverside Park, and they formed this lovely tableau with this beautiful portrait of young ladies draped in their American flags, with Uncle Sam holding the banner right in the center. And it's pictures like these that not only show our history, but also are wonderful works of art in themselves that have made working on this book such a delight and such a pleasure to do.
And also, it just showed the city's excitement and fervor for this event and their support of the Spanish-American War. And it's just amazing to think at periods of time we had more soldiers in our city than we did residents during this. So we have had some super events here in the town over the years.